Wonderful, welcome back. As promised, I will now give you the second part of the lecture, Deep Cognition, the part which we couldn't finish last time because I went way over time. Thanks for your patience again last time. So what we saw is that a lot of what we see in society generally, and of course in cities also specifically, has to do with our human brain. A brain which is highly plastic and adaptable and can react to new tasks very flexibly and can also accommodate to new environments very flexibly. And a lot of what we see is that we, in a continuously co-evolving, emergent way, have step by step transformed an original biological, ecological environment into the highly technological, cultural environment of cities which we are enjoying today. We did this as a species which left Africa around 65,000 years ago. At that moment we invented language, it seems. A small group of Homo sapiens traveled the Red Sea and then traveled the continents, became great as a species and abundant, but at the same time also changed the face of the planet in many ways. Also eliminating by whatever means other hominid species in the way. We saw that from a biological point of view, the following points were important. We talked about the mirror neuron system, which we conceptualized as something where neurons in our brain areas which are responsible for actions are also involved in reactions to the actions of other people. We talked about a dancer dancing and our motor neuron system kind of dancing with the dancer in our minds. We talked about feeling the pain of somebody else with empathy being located in the same brain areas where also our pain areas are located. We then extrapolated this system to tools where we are able to understand tools both being wielded by people as well as tools independently. Looking at a spear pains us because we feel it piercing our bellies. And we extrapolated it then further to the spaces and buildings in cities. A church with its symmetrical facade makes us stand upright, resonate with that church, and we do that individually. We do it next to a person. That person, therefore, through intersubjectivity relating to our relations to the church. And we can imagine that this happened hundreds of years. Therefore, that church stabilizing, probably via the mirroring systems, not only us, but also our ancestors. We then talked about the Dunbar number, where we said that primates have neocortexes which scale in size by group size. The bigger the neocortex, the bigger the group size. From monkeys to apes to Homo sapiens. We learned from Robin Dunbar that Homo sapiens normally, biologically, can deal with group sizes of 150 individuals. We find these individuals also even on large technological connectivity sites like, for example, Facebook. So 150 friends you can have. More than that are just acquaintances. We then conceptualized that cities in some ways, with their institutions and infrastructures, spaces and stories, are ways of scaling these original biological numbers by cultural means to much larger numbers. One of the most important tools for that being language, the ability to groom, so to speak, efficiently and fast. We also talked about the prospective brain, so the fact that our brain uses different brain areas for remembering the past and anticipating the future than being in the now. Interestingly, both remembering and anticipating uses similar structure or the same structures in the brain. This means we anticipate the future with things which we learned in the past, both through our bodies, through our stories, and in extrapolation through our cultures and the stories we tell each other. And we saw in general then also with the book by Yuval Harari, The Power of Homo sapiens, that naked primate, which went from 100 million different species, 1 million different species, to those almost 8 billion of one species, completely having changed the face of the planet. So this is what is embedded in our biological capability, the capability of having a highly plastic brain, plastic in terms of adaptability, a brain which is capable of having a symbolic culture, and through this symbolic culture we are effectively creating larger groups because we can establish trust more efficiently than by tactile social means. And we can also plan the future by remembering the past, and therefore are effectively collaborating in large deeds, for example, building a railroad. We then looked at interaction, where we talked about a series of people. We talked about the symbolic interactionism of George Herbert Mead, which is basically taking the idea of tools and objects which we already saw in the discussion of the mirroring system, and more broadly conceptualizes this as a way of organizing interactions between people. We saw the soldier with the cross, that cross meaning something to him, meaning something to us, and therefore generating a relationship between him and you. That then again we can extrapolate to buildings and spaces and cities even. We didn't talk about Erving Goffman and his ideas of roles and rituals, but it's basically an extrapolation of what George Herbert Mead is talking about with the conceptual framework of a theater, where through symbolic interactions, by playing roles, you define yourself in the context of others. We talked about the map, which I now see again on the wall of one of your colleagues. That both defining her as well as the relationship of her to others, that in the moment now, but also over time. Pierre Bourdieu then explained to us how these social relations can be conceptualized generally by the idea of capital. Capital not in terms of money, but capital in terms of cultural capital, of social capital. And his argument that people define themselves in a society by the capital they have. So the total sum of all good relations they have to other people, the total sum of trust they have vis-a-vis their creditors, the total sum of power attributed to them by other people. We also quickly looked at Niklas Luhmann, a sociologist who explained us that social systems also, in an emergent way, what he called autopoietic, are developing from simple systems to complex systems, to the invention of a law, to a legal system, then this legal system differentiating into different types of law, that then enabling groups of lawyers to have differentiated, increasingly complex lives, which gives them both social relevance as well as a place in the market. So this idea of emergence and differentiation, which we have seen in cities in the lecture 1, in spaces in lecture 2, is something which happens also in social systems, probably in some form of resonance with the physical world. So this idea of emergence, of a system being defined, happens in various ways in the complex system which we're currently looking at together in all of the lectures. And one thing maybe to take again with us is the idea of Niklas Luhmann that a system is defined by a boundary. So I'm maybe a lawyer and you are not. So I'm inside the system, you're not. Therefore, you're hiring me as a lawyer. And it is also defined by the fact that inside the system, the world is simplified by me looking at the world as a lawyer. And as soon as I don't believe in law anymore, then the system of lawyers and the system of law disappears. We talked about religion. As soon as we don't believe in religious tenets anymore, then religions as a thought model and as a societal organizing system, of course, will fall apart and disappear. And then finally, we very quickly talked about Alex Pentland and his idea of social physics. This is a link to a later lecture, which I will get to in a later lecture. The idea here is that these interactions, which we are now discussing, we can increasingly also see by the data trails these interactions leave. We then talked about transaction. And since we are here in a lecture on cognition, transaction is now not literally the work on and with matter, but rather an attempt to conceptualize how we think about material production and economies. You remember the video I have shown you about these Capuchin monkeys, which were very angry when they were treated unfairly. The point being here that an idea of morality is embedded already in our evolutionary ancestors. So fairness is not something only humans are experiencing and are thinking about and are rebelling against when they feel its absence, but it's something which is with us for much longer. It's a biological concept, not only a cultural concept. We then quickly talked about this complicated word of disadvantageous inequity aversion, which basically means being pissed when we're treated unfairly and it hurts us, conceptualized by the economist Ernst Fehr from the University of Zurich. We also saw the advantageous inequity aversion, which is being pissed when we see that we are treated better than the person next to us, because we understand that this is both maybe dangerous for us as well as dangerous for the larger common good. Therefore, we also tend to, if we are intelligent, cultured people, we also tend to be against the person next to us being treated much worse than we are. Of course, and again, this is something embedded in a very deep way, both in us as individuals as well as in us as societies. And the way of embedding these ideas changes over the course of history. So we have societies where these inequity aversion is felt very strongly. We have other societies where inequity aversion is embedded in the moral code. For example, in the system of slavery of the Roman Empire. It is then, of course, explained by very strong narratives. We quickly talked about the economy of cities again, Jane Jacobs, who is saying that everything we see or everything we experience as economy is always going back to the very real economy of cities, rather than the implied economy of nations, as she would argue, as Adam Smith kind of proposed. We were, in a very frivolous way, also quickly talking about Karl Marx. There, I only want you to take with you a couple of key ideas. Key idea number one is that he takes the concept of the tyranny of a person, the tyrant, quote unquote, of people like Montesquieu, and translates that to an impersonal concept, i.e. capital. So his argument primarily is that we are not subjugated anymore and subservient to a particular person, but rather to a system which we are partially involved also in establishing. I think this is a helpful way of thinking about it, and I hope you agree with me, because it depersonalizes the issue of the capitalists to some degree. Capitalists as people are problematic, and we can talk about that later a bit. But what I want to impress on you is the power of the system we are all in. And in that way, the capitalist, quote unquote, is just a symptom. It's not necessarily the cause of the problems we are facing. In addition to that, we talked about reification and commodity fetishism quickly, which is basically saying that we are not anymore interested in an industrialized world in the personal relations which are embedded in an object. So, for example, a bag which somebody made for you and you remember the person who made that bag. Or a meal which has been prepared for you by your mother and you remember your mother by the meals she made for you. But much rather, you now only look at the object and you are disregarding the labor which is embedded in the object. So you see a bag and you fetishize that bag and you have no clue who made that bag, whether that person was treated fairly or unfairly. You don't care. Specifically, also when that bag, of course, has a great brand label on it. The other side of that is what Marx and Engels call false consciousness, which is that you as a worker give up the control over your production and your labor, and you assume you're just a little wheel in a much bigger machine, and you have no right to your personal labor. And they would argue this is a false consciousness, it's a false narrative which is impressed on you by, again, the capitalist system we are in, or of course by the capitalists. Again, this second argument I find more problematic. And we finally have talked about David Graeber, the idea of debt and money, the point that debt is something very, very old. And originally it was something very informal, because it was a debt you have towards your parents. It would be weird to calculate the exact amount of money you owe your parents for raising you. That would be a weird idea, right? And you cannot put that into a money amount. But as soon as you have bigger structures, bigger social structures, it becomes necessary for these structures to exist to abstract the idea of debt. For example, by money. And we have seen that Graeber understands money very much as a military technology, which allows you to exert power in a social context by establishing, on the one hand, a market economy, a tax system, and also a military which enforces both. And David Graeber, we saw, conceptualizes that the emergence of this system of formalized debt expressed as money, and in the worst case also lived as slavery, so debt which cannot be paid back, therefore a person needs to become enslaved. He conceptualized that as happening exactly at the moment of what Jaspers called the Axial Age, so the moment of an intellectual awakening around 600 to 300 before Christ. And he argues that these two are related, so that the emergence of more abstract markets, of bigger urban societies, are linked to a conceptualizing what's happening in this moment of abstraction, both in terms of philosophy as well as in terms of religion. This sounds all extremely complicated, and taken together, think about this in a way that we are having a system of connectedness. And in the beginning, this system of connectedness has direct links, a high degree of informality, and narratives which were fairly simple, narratives which still follow the narratives of groups. And now you take this and you want to scale up. You want to make this system of connectedness bigger. Because you're, for example, as a king, you're interested in power, or as you see a technological opportunity. And probably this is not anybody's individual idea, but it's again a kind of an emergent co-evolution. And through the invention of tools of abstraction of relations, for example, the invention of money, of coins, 300 before Christ, the invention of capital in the 18th century, these were all moments of abstraction and scaling of connectedness, and this abstraction had to be explained by new narratives, and it led to new moments of emancipation, of finding a way vis-a-vis these bigger and bigger systems, whether this be Christian martyrs or revolting laborers. Right? So all of this intellectual history we are looking at here has to do with scaling a system and the pain we are going through while scaling it. Right? So you don't need to understand all of this in detail, but take with you this story of scaling up and the pain of scaling experienced by individuals and the narratives which are required to keep this scaled system intact, and by the emancipation which is needed to revolt against narratives which are too brutal and too unfair, right? Because unfairness, as we have seen, the push against unfairness is embedded in us in very, very deep ways. One more person is interesting because it again is a very simple thought model which might be good for you to have, and this is Karl Pollani, an interesting economist who was conceptualizing again the moment of industrialization from a slightly different point of view than Marx, but in very similar ways. He brought two big ideas, which in some ways you already have heard from me, but Pollani will allow you to put it into your mental map quite effectively. His main argument is that politics and economy are not two separate disciplines in many ways, but they always co-emerge. He looked very specifically at the moment when we scaled by the material changes brought upon us by industrialization. We scaled up and invented two things. We invented the market economy on the one hand, and on the other hand, we invented the nation state. So he thought that these are not two separate things which coincided randomly, accidentally, but much rather are together the great transformation and the invention of market society. And we, in our discussions of deep urbanism, would argue it's the invention of a system which is enabled by industry, enabled by infrastructure, and needed new narratives and a new way of doing business within that. And the result is basically the modern nation state we are currently living in, based on a market, and Pollani would argue together this is the market society. So it's a similar idea than Marx, with a slightly different angle. And what is interesting is that he deplores, most importantly, in this moment of transition and transformation, the loss of what he calls embeddedness. Embeddedness is for him the concept of being in local social relationships where you have individual contacts and where you can structure your life by, let's say, more informal means. And when losing that, we went to a system where we have formal contacts, which are, however, a lot more impersonal, because we don't know the people we are interacting with, which therefore need to be structured by a strong state and by the abstract system of the market. And you realize it's always the same idea. right? It's the idea of scaling beyond what we can do biologically or by groups which we can organize informally to systems which have to be structured formally, impersonally, and have to be narrated by stories which explain these impersonal relationships. For example, by the story of all being sons and daughters of one father, right, which is Christianity, where Christ becomes the embodiment of this younger generation, the sons and the daughters, or in Christianity more specifically the sons, and therefore we all somehow function together, right? Or on the other hand, it's the big story of the market, where you are paying for goods in clearly organized ways, and these payments is organized by a system of banking, by a system of loans, and these loans are enforced by a state which is able to put you into prison when you don't pay back your debt, right? But it's always, it's in many ways, you know, as soon as you start thinking like that, then this idea of false consciousness, which Marx introduced, you can apply to many different things. You can apply it to your relationship with your bank, and you can think, okay, what the hell is going on? I have some abstract number, which I see on a computer screen, which supposedly has something to do with a bank account in a place which I don't understand, with a bank I don't have a particularly personal relationship to. And with these abstract digits, I pay probably through some form of online banking my coursework at the HSE, right? All of these narratives and technologies together allow us to live a form of connectedness which is going way beyond what we ever would have been able to do by purely informal biological means. I think that's the main argument. Now, the issue is that if we now understand that we generate this abstract system of connectedness, which we cannot supervise so easily anymore by personal means, then we need to understand the dynamics of this system. What I mean is that if you are treated unfairly by a colleague of yours, it's very simple to tell him or her. You can just tell him, this is unfair, right? If one of your about 150 friends treats you unfairly, you can react. You can tell him, hey, what's going on? Treat me fairly. Or you can avoid him or her in the future because you can put a face to the name. As soon as however, we go as a society into more abstract systems, we need to understand the dynamics in this system because it can become abusive quite quickly. And maybe, as David Graeber would argue, some of this abuse is already built into the system. Part of scaling has to do with treating people in a fairly brutal way unfairly. And one of the most important dynamics to understand is this Matthew theorem, which we already talked about. It's a quote from the evangelist Matthew, who talks about Jesus and his parable of the talents. And it says, "For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken even that which he hath." So the argument is that watch out. society can be inherently unfair. The rich get richer quicker than the people who don't have so much money, and people who do not have money at all, they might even lose the very little they have. And in some ways, this is, of course, given in the Bible as a moral argument, but what we see in complex system science is that this Matthew effect is actually something which is probably inherent in any system. And it means that, and it has to do with the idea of proportional growth, which is very simply saying that if you have a fair amount of money, it's much easier for you to organize your life in a way that you get richer quickly. If you don't have these means, then this is extremely hard to do. The same is true for cities. Cities which are already fairly large, triggered, for example, by an inherent advantage they have, like a good port, for example, like Rome. Those cities can grow bigger much more quickly than cities which are small, and as soon as you have a bigger city in the neighborhood of a small city, that bigger city will grow much, much more rapidly than the small city next to it. It's almost impossible for the small city to catch up. And this is kind of built into any system, and therefore there needs to be a corrective in these systems, or in our case, societies and cities. Correctives like, for example, the temple in the Sumerian cities, which were large redistribution centers. So there needs to be a concept of balancing out, to some degree at least, the unfairness inherent in open systems. And one of the tools to balance this out is, for example, the idea of the welfare state, the idea of taxes as a form of redistribution, kind of as a top-down way of thinking. And as a bottom-up way of thinking, there is the idea of the commons and the group, which we can use to conceptualize the idea of fairness not only as a moral issue, but rather as an understanding that in order for these systems to function, we need forms of redistribution, because open systems tend to inherently, through the effect of proportional growth, generate difference, right? So inequality is almost a law of physics. Equality is a political choice. And any successful society needs to make these good political choices in order to function. We can talk about this in later lectures a bit more, but and in the end of this lecture I will get back to it. But again, point one, we need to understand what's happening over the course of urbanity as forms of scaling. These generate increasingly large systems of connectedness, and these systems of connectedness have inherent dynamics, most importantly dynamics which generate inequality. And inequality happens almost automatically. Therefore, we need good narratives to argue for forms of redistribution to generate more equality on the one hand as a moral issue in the terms of narrative, but in the second hand also as a complex systems dynamics concept of stabilizing the system we're living in. Now, this becomes, of course, important specifically when we talk about increasingly connected, increasingly global systems, and these increasingly connected systems we generate, of course, by synchronizing connectedness, by accelerating it, and by virtualizing it. And I can give you a general concept of this. So speeding up was possible through a series of technologies that translated energy into transactions. So by harboring energy increasingly efficiently, from the human energy of the slaves which were rowing Cleopatra up the Nile, to the mechanical energy of the industries in England, which allowed us to enter the Industrial Age, where basically we are able to move physical matter more effectively and transform matters into commodities more effectively. But it's also, speeding up is also happening through turning transactions into interactions. So change information, to move information, not physical goods, and to create symbolic value, not use value, fetish, not function. And increasingly also virtualize interactions by increasing distance, speed, and access of interaction. So this is the general idea. Connectedness, in order to scale them up, we not only need to be able to abstract connectedness in terms of money and other tools, and stabilizing them by strong states and narratives, such as, for example, religions, but we also need to invent technologies which allow us to increasingly move information rather than matter. And I can give you examples of this. So, for example, in the area of interaction, we have the step from language, which we have been discussing, to writing, and then writing has become increasingly virtual, from clay tablets, which were heavy, to stones, to paper, to email. We have telecommunication, people talking person to person, then they talk via phone, via recordings, via video, via Skype, right? All of these are technologies for increasing the effectiveness by which we can generate connections over ever larger distances. In trade, we have the scaling of infrastructure. We have the scaling of material production, from craft to manufacturing to industrialization. And in religion, we have the scaling of trust through increasingly powerful narratives. With empire, we have the scaling of control through increasingly strong state structures. With money, we have the scaling of value, from coins to paper money, letters, and digital transactions. And with media, we have the scaling of perception, the scaling of communication in ever broader ways. I'll give you examples of that. So this is an early form of writing, right? First, I told you I will give you beer a week from now, so please help me with harvesting my barley. This is a personal communication by language. As soon as I'm able to press this promise I make you into this piece of clay, that I will give you beer if you help me now, I can therefore acquire the labor not only of you, whom I know, but also of maybe 200 people I do not know, right? Because I have a tool of generating that quote-unquote contract. I'm able to scale. Or here, a papal bull, so a letter from the Pope from 12,068, right? The Pope organizing the narrative of Christianity, which I am maybe interested as a German king to use to gain power. That abstract Pope in Rome can have a physical presence with this letter and that papal seal at the bottom, and therefore impress on me, the German king, and the people I'm dealing with, authority which I can translate into power, right? So the Pope, the Pope as a physical person is able to project his physicality through space and time with the ability to write something down and put the seal as a early form of authentication, right? This is kind of a very early form of cryptography, so to speak, right? As an early form of authentication to project his presence to another place and another time. And then, of course, interesting things started happening. We have the invention of the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell making one of the first calls to Chicago here, 1892. Right? Voice is able to be projected over large spaces. I mean, imagine what we are doing now and the connectedness we are enjoying at the very moment now me speaking to you. And I want to give you with the example of Graham Bell's invention a quick view into the scaling up of this technology and the change of what's happening by scaling this technology in new ways. With a little case study of a project which we did for Deutsche Telekom, a kind of an intellectual project, a kind of trying to tell them a story about their own future. Arrogant as we are, we do that with a lot of disciplines we don't understand well enough as an office. But again, so Deutsche Telekom asked us to do a kind of a visitor center, and we answered by trying to tell the story of telecommunication in a new way. So what you see here on the left is the early form of making calls. You were sitting at your home, you called an operator. That operator was in an office, the image on the left, and the operator physically connected your telephone cable to the telephone cable which the person you wanted to reach was connected to. Physically, right? By plugging this cable from one point to the next point, right? This is how it started. Now the Staugher switch in the middle is a very interesting thing. I don't know whether you remember the old rotary phones, but maybe you have seen it in movies. So the rotary phones, you turned the dial, and then you let the dial rotate back. And by rotating back, the dial made clicks. It made as many clicks as the number you dialed. So that when you dial a 4, when the rotary goes back, it makes 4 clicks. These 4 clicks basically told this switch here that he should click, 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 go to position 4 in his switch, right? By turning the rotary and by letting the rotary going back, you basically gave a programming input, or specifically you gave a command to the switch. Your finger gave a command to the switch, to this exact switch, telling him to proceed by 4 points, by 4 steps. And by dialing a number, you were basically, you yourself with your finger, you were giving a command to this switch, and this switch basically connected you now automatically to the number you want to dial, right? But this was a mechanical operation, right? So you didn't have a person anymore. You had a mechanical switch, which acted as a stepper. But at the same time, it was a very mechanical interaction. And now, then a lot of these switches were basically the early hubs for linking people to other people. Now, what was interesting is that by telephony scaling up, you had a business model for telecom companies to bury copper wire in the ground. Right? There was an incentive for a company to go through the expense of linking everybody with everybody through copper wire, which is a crazy thing to do, right? Like, why the hell would you have a company who is burying copper wires? But the business model of linking everybody to everybody and the technological invention of the phone number and the ability for these phone numbers to act as a script to connect person to person was attractive a business model enough for these companies to do this. And because all of this was centralized, these telecom companies had a lot of central control. Everything had to go through these hubs. And the effects of telephony on real space was an unprecedented synchronization of activities. And that led to an increase in size and complexity of spatial topologies. So on the left you had the Empire State Building. And the amazing thing of telephony now was that you could sit in an office 10 stories higher, still in the same company and in the same building, but spatially separated with an elevator, which you don't want to take whenever you have a small question, right? The telephone now allowed you to call from the executive floor down to your secretaries, and you were able to operate a company in a high-rise due to the telephone, right? You can also, here the Ford Motor Company, you can operate a large industrial site because you can call from one side of an assembly line, which might be several hundred meters long, to the other side of the assembly line. So a mistake on one end of the assembly line does not automatically generate total chaos. Imagine without a telephone, people would need to run back and forth through these long spaces and say, stop, the assembly line, we have a problem on the other end. Now you just take the telephone and you call to the other end of the factory. And of course the same is true for the railroad. You can organize railroads over long distances. You could already do that by the telegraph, but for our case now, the telephone is of course a more coherent example. So you can organize activities over space. That allows you to scale space in the form of high-rises, in the form of large factories, or even in the form of integrated spatial systems, just like the railroad. Now, the effects of this moment of scaling is amazing. The effect was that a company, by assembling all of the consumer money they were able to, because they gave this great infrastructural service, that company was able, or these companies were able to establish a wire infrastructure throughout the territory of large states. It's amazing, right? All of a sudden, everybody's connected to everybody with copper wires in the ground. The problem, however, of this early form of communication was that these copper lines were fixed, linear, and serial, right? You could only call one person at a time. So the Zoom discussion we have right now would be utterly impossible, right? Because the link between these copper layers is linear and it's mechanical. I can only call one of you, and I can tell my story only to one of you at a time, right? Because these links are linear, they're highly vulnerable. And this means two things. First of all, if one of these hubs where the switches are located is broken, an entire city has no phones, no phone connections. This is one problem. And the second problem of these linear connections is that the product of probability of failure per node. That means that each node is a source of potential failure. So if in each one of these switches the probability of failure is 0.0001%, which is almost nothing. However, if I have this probability over many nodes, all of a sudden failure is possible, right? So a telecom company, therefore, in this old model is completely concentrated on keeping this service intact and needs to have an absolutely perfect node system, because if one node fails, everything fails, and if nodes are faulty, the probability of a phone connection not working is rising by each node I'm phoning through, right? The third problem is that the connection is endpoint agnostic, because I need a phone number as a script to establish a connection, right? So the intelligence is in the switch. The intelligence is not in the endpoint of the connection. I might, with a phone number, I might call you at home, but I might call somebody completely different. And for sure, when you leave your phone, I cannot call you, because I'm not connected to you. I'm connected to a piece of machinery on the table of some room somewhere in the world, right? That phone is stupid. It has no idea who is behind the phone. And it is not usable for data, because data is too efficient, right? It's basically, it's too cheap to move data, so it's not a functioning business model. So the infrastructure which has been established by this early moment of scaling connectedness is brilliant, right? But all of a sudden we have completely different problems. We have different needs, because we expect something else from this system. Now the next big invention, of course, is the ARPANET, which was triggered by military money in the United States, was then invented in Xerox PARC, and was basically a concept of linking these nodes, which we now have established, in new ways, and specifically make these nodes a lot more intelligent, give them information so that they can choose the route by which the information travels. Right? It's a completely different idea than the mechanical switches which we have seen before. It's an idea now of having intelligent nodes, not intelligent switches, and these mechanical switches. And these nodes can find the way they talk to other nodes themselves. And this allows, of course, to have a completely decentralized system, which we know today as the internet. And the main invention here was an invention of protocol. So not anymore a phone number, but a more clever way of linking two nodes, two endpoints, so to speak, by giving the endpoints specific addresses. And by having packets between these endpoints travel by whatever means they travel, because the packages which are traveling have the information in them. That's the so-called TCP/IP protocol, right? So instead of mechanically linking two people with the old system, I now define an information package. I give this information package an address, a sender and a recipient, and then I don't care how this information package is traveling, as long as it is handed off at each intermediate node in the correct way to reach the end node. That was the amazing invention of the TCP/IP protocol, and therefore the start of the internet. And what's happening now in real space is, of course, that we have this very liquid information which we are now enjoying today, right? Which allows us a simultaneous global presence. For example, me talking to all of you sitting in very different locations distributed all over the world, right? This does something spatially. Something happens also in space. For example, we have city centers as centers of control. We have these global data management companies. And most importantly, on the right, we have post-Fordism, right? Ford's factory was still coherent in space. Now I can take a Ford factory, a car factory, I can take that, I can cut it up into different value-adding moments. So I can take a full value chain of creating an automobile. I can cut that up into different portions, and I can link these sub-value chains, I can link them by digital means, by spatially distributed supply chains, because I can organize that, right? I can have a car seat produced in Poland, I can truck that to Germany, and I can put that car seat into a framework which I have built in Germany, and they're there on time, and the truck driver now knows where to go, because all of this is in a much more liquid way organized than was ever thinkable before. Now, the result of this internet is that we have a global market and resources established, so we have a global audience, right? So we can talk to a lot of people simultaneously. However, because the TCP/IP protocol has an origin computer, so to speak, or server, and it has an end server, it is still anonymous. It's not linked. So the TCP/IP protocol is not linked to actual people. It is linked to abstract addresses, and the protocol also does not know what is in it. It does not know what's inside the information package. So the problems is that only point connection from server to client is possible. The server provides authentication of the content, but I don't know whether in this content contains a book which is stolen, so copyright infringement. I don't know whether this content contains child pornography, right? Because the protocol does not say something about what's in it, and it does not say with a name who it is going to. So it's data agnostic, right? So there's no data authentication, there's no prioritization. So the TCP/IP protocol does not care whether it's a Netflix movie or a nuclear launch code prevention, right? And it has no spam filtering and so on embedded in the protocol, right? So it is still a fairly stupid, so to speak, protocol. So the scaling was successful, but by the scaling, we generated new problems. Therefore, not the infrastructure is bad, but we have now problems generated by that infrastructure which we now have to solve. And that was now the launch then into a new discussion with the telecom company, where we were talking about this content-centric network, where the idea is that you have now different ways of organizing the internet, which is more organized around peer-to-peer networks, where I have clear recipients and clear points who send. And I can also organize better ways of organizing data packages so that the protocol itself knows what's in the data package. The idea of this content-centric network architecture, which is an extremely interesting idea. And of course, I'm fairly independent of a network topology. So for example, what we're doing right now is one of the consequences of this revolution which happened, which is that point-to-point connections are now incredibly simple, and therefore the telecom company becomes just a carrier, but they don't control anymore our conversation right now, right? So the effects already happened. The effects are a very mobile creative class. I can have social graphs like the social graph of our discussion right now, distributed all over the globe. I can even do ad hoc networking. So if I have a series of mobile phones in an urban space, I can completely bypass a carrier, a telecom carrier, and link the phones directly. So the result of these content-centric networks is that I have now public established, so I have a collective made up of known individuals and known locations. And integrity and trust are properties of content, not of the channel. That also means, of course, that the telecom companies lose control. They lose control because of the TCP/IP, right, which was the change from early telecom to the internet telecom moment, where the telecom loses control of the protocol. They're not able anymore to sell their switches. Through mesh networking, they lose control over topology, mid-range infrastructure. Due to content-centric networking, they lose control over authentication. Due to deregulation, they lose control over the last mile. Due to the open Wi-Fi spectrum, they lose the wireless advantage. And due to Android, they lose the control over applications. So, whereas the telecom company started as a highly top-down organized, infrastructure-based, capital-intense business case, which allowed them to invest money to put copper lines into the ground. This control over the network is now increasingly lost, right? So what could they focus on? They could focus on premium connectivity, they could focus on authentication services, or they could focus on data mining, and of course, all of these things companies are doing now. By the way, this study is from 2008, so at that moment these ideas were still fairly new. And now this is something you now all know. So this is your analog self, and that has now a digital self. For example, your Facebook graph, or in that time, Second Life was still important. And you have the mesh of the net now turning into the mesh of people. And the interesting thing is that specifically a mobile phone company, what they do is they give you a service which allows you to combine identity, so you and your mobile phone, right? Identity, organized by your phone number or increasingly by your email address, for example, right? Identity. The company still gives you connectivity, so I can talk to you right now, and increasingly with GPS, they know where you are, right? So this is now the new business case, which is of course increasingly interesting. So linking identity, connectivity on geography, and with that you can have the mobile phone and at the bottom left, and you can have physical data mining, what we called in 2008 Fugel, what is called today big data, as a extreme new business case for telecom companies. And all of that in between you now know today as the App Store of Apple, or you know it as the Android store. You know, all of these things which at that time were kind of new ideas, now you know, of course, in your daily life as all of these little apps and tools which link, so connectivity, link you in a specific location with your identity to a particular service, right? So what started with Graham Bell inventing a way of talking through a copper wire, through a series of business cases, scaling up, linking everything with everything, has now resolved in a way where in fact everything is linked with everything, has generated an ecosystem of services which we all use, but at the same time has led to the loss of power of telecom companies who were responsible to put the copper into the wire, and the rise of companies which are able to generate business cases in this cloud. Google, Apple, and others, right? So this is a short history of a particular idea or a particular technology dealing with communication, and showing you the emergence, so the co-evolution of infrastructure, of markets, of business cases, and of new opportunities in your daily lives, simultaneously enabling you as well as enslaving you into this system. And you all know that, right? And again, it's the same story which we have seen repeatedly, just something which is now very, very close to you. In a later lecture, we will see how that then translates also into ideas of artificial intelligence, so on and so on, which is of course then further and further steps into this world of the digital, which we will hear about in the future. Now, the important thing here I want to impress on you is the medium is the message. And through the message, the medium starts to adapt and change. The medium is the message is a statement by Marshall McLuhan, which you see here in front of these TV screens. And the medium is the message was a phrase introduced in McLuhan's book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, published in 1964. McLuhan proposes that a medium itself, not the content it carries, should be the focus of study. He said that a medium affects the society in which it plays a role, not only by the content delivered over the medium, but also by the characteristics of the medium itself. Right? And now you understand that with the idea of the telephone I have given you earlier. But of course you also understand, I hope, that the medium is the message, I could also say as an urbanist about cities. The city is the message, right? Because it is both environment, format, medium and infrastructure in which we operate. And by its shape, it shapes us. And again, now we're here at the matrix again, right, where the architect in Matrix 2 is very much, of course, exactly Marshall McLuhan telling us that the medium is the message, right? That we are all part of this matrix, and this matrix is basically, on the one hand, of course, visible to us as many forms of content, narratives, ideas, stories, interactions. But in the end, this system of connectedness is a lot more powerful than each individual content itself. Right, so the architect sitting like Marshall McLuhan in front of these screens is in some ways also a symbol of ourselves starting to understand the urban system truly as a system, both enabling us as well as enslaving us in how it functions. This is a kind of a workshop which I was part of, where we talked with different journalists about the future of journalism, the effects of digitalization, both in terms of fake news as well as also with the opportunities of investigative journalism and so on. So both being the problem as well as the solution, of course, lying in digitalization as always, right? This is a kind of a graph I developed in this workshop, and it is basically extremely simple. It's an idea of journalism or of broadcasting in general as the linking of stories on the right with technologies of generating an audience, right? The technologies might be a book, it might be a newspaper, it might be radio, it might be TV. These are audience technologies or a public delivery system, right? A system that gives us an integrated group of people I can talk to. And on the right-hand side, I have the journalistic process where I am generating stories to feed into this audience. And I called this Agora. I will explain that in a second. And the role of this storytelling to audiences is twofold. On the one hand, we tell stories to generate stability, right? To explain an election and say the election has been safe, don't worry. I can do that in a newspaper, or I can do that with a TV anchor with a very authoritative voice. The elections have been okay, don't worry, don't revolt, right? So storytelling for stability. But I can also tell stories to renew, in that I am speaking truth to power, right? And with that, journalism is of course one of the many ways of both stabilizing as well as renewing this constantly co-evolving emergent system we are talking to. And the argument is that this storytelling can happen in an agora, in a large square, for example, in the old Greek city-states, where the public domain was a public square, sufficiently large to hold people, and sufficiently well organized that me, with my voice, I can reach this group of people. But also this is a public domain generated by Gutenberg inventing the printing press, and with that printing press at the same time giving the gospel to ever more people than ever before, increasingly also in German language, of course, but at the same time also destabilizing the old power structure of the Catholic Church, right? So it's a new tool to generate a public. The coffee houses in London in the beginning of the 17th century were our modern market society, as Pollani would say, was actually invented and started. At these coffee houses, you were not only consuming coffee from your colonies in the early British Commonwealth, you were also looking at the very first journals, the first printed newspapers, the dailies or the journals, which gave you a way of organizing the ideas of these people in these coffee shops in a way that they were able to generate again the modern nation state. Right? So that there's a public domain generated both by coffee as well as by the early journals, or the public domain generated by radio, allowing you to integrate a nation and send them to war, or a public generated by the printing press, also of course increasingly suffering due to digitalization, or the public generated by a TV studio, which we worked on here in ZDF, where of course you have this highly virtual green space in the background being assembled into a image which is of course completely fake, but nevertheless allows you to tell stories increasingly efficiently. And then of course you have the public domain of social media with all the opportunities and difficulties which we currently know of. You know, here Facebook is disabling billions of fake accounts, which increases rapidly. So the conclusion to all of this is that we have systems which scale, where connectedness by technological means is becoming ever more encompassing. And these systems of connectedness have a technological background, and that means that the organization, medium, or infrastructure platform is the public, right? These backgrounds are always created. So the public as an abstract entity does not exist. There is no public, right? Beyond your 150 friends you can talk to personally, there is nothing like a public. It does not exist. But much rather, it is created ever anew by those infrastructures and institutions people see as normal. So there is the public of the Greek city-state organized by a speaker on the agora. There's the public of the emerging English British nation state created by these coffee house journals informing an active citizenry. There is the public of the New York Times readers. There is the public of the people listening to a radio. And again, you always have moments of control where a system like that is established. So a public radio station is established with money from the state, for example. And then you have the dissolution of these systems of generating a public, because our technological progress always leads us to new ways of generating connectedness. So the public is always a product of technology augmenting social connectedness. And I would also argue social media is bad urbanism. Right? Social media has been created by people who do not understand all of the complexities of social systems you now understand, right? So there are issues of social control, there are issues of fairness, there are issues of authentication, etc., etc., which we take for granted in our cities, where streets are public, controlled by a police, apartments are private, uncontrolled, but under your personal control, right? In a city is a social system which we now understand quite well how to organize. However, social media has not learned that yet, right? So I'm waiting for good urbanists doing better social media at some point. So now if we take all of this together, and now I think you're ready to understand it, we can go to a next person, to Yuval Portugali. And his achievement was that he structures what we have now been talking about in a slightly more comprehensive way. He originally comes out of agent modeling, so where he programmed little agents, in virtual space, of course, little computer programs working together to generate complex systems. And he realized that these agents were not intelligent enough. And so he started to conceptualize agents which have an inner plan, an agent which can react to the systems these agents build. Or more specifically, in our conversation right now, at first he wanted to model cities with robots who had no mind, so to speak, and he realized that in order to model cities better, he needs to have this idea of embodied minds in his simulation, right? Because otherwise the cities he tries to program are not functioning. And so he wrote a book, for example, called Complexity, Cognition, and the City. So what I'm trying to tell you is that he talks about the things which we now have been talking about, but he comes from a computer programming direction where he tried to program a city as a complex systems with an agent-based design, agent-based simulation software, realizing that he needs to have agents which are more clever than simple automatons. Specifically, he needs agents which have in their virtual heads, so to speak, an image of the system they're creating. So first of all, he talks about complexity itself and says complexity is a theory, or rather a family of theories that deal with open, complex, far from equilibrium systems that achieve their order spontaneously by means of self-organization. Right? We talked about that a lot already. And he also says that network, or rather the new science of networks, is one of the family, the recent complexity theory that explores the network properties of complex systems by means of graph theoretic methodologies. So what I'm trying to say to you is that all of what we now have been discussing in our deep urbanism lectures is something which is conceptualized by this complex system science, of which Yuval Portugali is one proponent. I hope I have given you a richer understanding, however, of complex system science than just programming agents. But nevertheless, it is interesting to think through the things he's saying in his book, because he gives you, again, an efficient way of more easily keeping in your head what I have told you in the last 4 or 5 lectures. So he's one of the proponents that thinks that a science of city is possible, and that is an old notion that claims or aims to transform the study of cities from a soft social theory-oriented study into a hard science. So people like Michael Batty argue that complexity theories with their arsenal of methodologies can genuinely give rise to a new science of cities. And I agree with that completely. However, I hope I have given you an overview over what would need to be involved into this new science of cities in order to prevent it from becoming purely technocratic. But again, what is interesting with Portugali is these 4 points. So what makes cities complex? And you know all of that. It's basically a repetition, the summary of things you already know. Firstly, he says, cities are composed of material components and human components, so of things and people. As a set of material components alone, the city is an artifact and as such a simple system. Right? An artifact like a hill or like a rock. A city in itself, simply as matter, is nothing complex. However, as a set of human components, the urban agents, the city is a complex system. So as soon as you add humans to the mix, this inert matter of a city becomes complex. It is the urban agents that by means of their interaction among themselves or with the city's material components and with the environment, transform the artifact city into the complex artificial system city. Right? I talked about that already. Again, it's actually very super simple. It means that only by cities being inhabited by people, cities become complex. Cities on their own are just archaeological artifacts. Secondly, as a complex artificial system, the city emerges out of the interactional activities of its agents. But once it emerges, it affects, so it enslaves, in the language of synergetics, the behavior of its agents and so on in circular causality, what we now in the lectures have called emergence. The city in this respect is a complex artificial environment. Right? We have called this now in the lectures always as co-evolving, as emerging, etc., etc. Furthermore, because of its size, the city is a large-scale collective and complex artifact that on the one hand interacts with its environment, while on the other it is an environment for the millions of people that live and act in cities. Right, so this whole thing is also very large and changes over time. Thirdly, however, artifacts are not just the outcome of human interaction, rather they are also the media of interaction. The process involves, on the one hand, internal representations in the form of ideas, intentions, memories, thoughts that originate and reside in the mind, brain of urban agents, while on the other, external representations, that is to say, artifacts such as text, cities, buildings, and roads that reside in the world. So exactly as artifacts cannot directly interact among themselves, so also ideas, thoughts, intentions, plans, and other internal representations cannot. What we called earlier this kind of line of thought of symbolic interactionisms. They interact by means of the externally represented artifacts, be they texts, clothes, buildings, neighborhoods, and whole cities and metropoles. Right, so I think you understand that by now, that we need these representations in order then to be, so these things in real space, we need to have them both act on us and then we act back, and only the whole thing together, so us individually, collectively, in this environment of the city, becomes a complex system. And there's a technical term which you might be interested in is the SIRN, the synergetic interrepresentation networks, which he argues came to capture this interaction between internal and external representations. Now, fourthly, the city is a dual complex system, also in the sense that the city as a whole is a complex system and each of its agents is a complex system. The implication is that we have to include the cognitive capability of the urban agents in the dynamics of cities. And his book, Complexity, Cognition, the City, was a first attempt in this direction, and maybe this lecture is a second attempt. So here, summarized as a graphic, so we have here a brain which is, so to speak, passive. It receives a stimulus and lets out a response. This is kind of behaviorism. Right, so the brain is actually fairly stupid, so to speak, and unstructured. However, cognitivism, which is the current moment we think, the current way we think about the brain, means that there is an internal representation of the external world. And I think I have explained to you that this internal representation goes from the very physical, biological, to the highly aggregated metaphorical, so an internal representation of the world. And that internal representation is then affected by external stimuli and makes responses. And now what João Portugali adds is that the external representation is also in some ways, of course, linked to that internal representation, and through that the city as artifacts and our individual brains linked by these artifacts to a collective complex system, that in the end is the complex system, the emergence of which we are discussing in these lectures. This is all complex sounding, but I think in the end you intuitively probably understand it already, right? So, and maybe if you look at this lecture a second time and think about it again, you will know what this all means. But again, I think the important message for me is the co-emergence of the material world of the cities with our societal world, which both affects us individually as well as collectively. And this is a kind of a formal representation of this, which, however, I would find in its reductive representation incredibly poor compared to what I tried to tell you over the last 5 lectures. Now, just ending now, we're almost at the end. All of that, of course, has also political consequences, for which, for example, an author like George Lakoff is a really interesting source of insight. And Lakoff is interesting because he also understands that we are embodied minds and that metaphors are going back to very deep biological roots. So metaphors, for example, I made a point, or I won the argument, or I conquered your minds with my great narrative. Right? These are all arguments out of physicality, I made a point, arguments out of interaction, maybe even conflict, I won the argument. So, I skipped this a bit. And that means that whenever we look at this world with its unequal distribution of opportunities and inequalities. For example, in housing wealth in England, or even housing wealth compressed into the center of London, and the unequal wealth distribution in the world, and the change of this unequal distribution over time. So you have here global income in the 1800, 1975, and today, and how it changes. And also the change of income in the last 20 years, so to speak, where you have a lot of people being risen out of poverty on the one hand, some people becoming incredibly rich, but exactly the well-to-do of the recent past losing the most, right? All of that, my argument being, is part of the system we are currently in, right? So you have the winners, the middle classes of the emerging economies. You have the very rich, which are growing rich in almost insane ways right now. You have the global losers, the very poor, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And you have the new losers, which are citizens of rich countries with stagnating incomes, plus much of the population of former communist countries. And that, of course, generates now a lot of these political upheavals which we are currently witnessing and which we already have been talking about, right? With, for example, and this is very much a problem also of city populations versus rural populations, and of a kind of an old form of meritocracy, which I will talk about at a later time, because again, we are running a bit too long. The final idea I want to leave you with is this link between our minds and the city, and the constant co-creation of society in the interaction between these two, and our duty on the one hand to understand what is really going on in this resonance between the two on the one hand, and an understanding also of the dynamics of this complex system in order to organize it better. Because again, complex systems tend to be inherently unfair. They generate change which is specifically being seen as unfair. And we are now required, I believe, to, with an understanding of these dynamics, which you have seen in earlier lectures, with an understanding of the local embedded in the more large scale, with an understanding of the ability to remember and the ability to change, to also think beyond moments of radical change, like, for example, rising sea levels. And this is almost a form of science fiction. Here, one of my favorite science fiction writers, and by now a personal friend. And generating in these futures, which are hard to imagine, hard to control, still positive narratives with the vision of fulfilling lives with a sufficient amount of fairness so that we can share these fulfilling lives. And therefore, my aim with these lectures is very much to give you a sense of depth, a sense and understanding of deep urbanism, because we are living in an age of instability. That's the end. And sorry again, it was again long, but I hope you survived it.
Thank you so much, Markus. Are there any comments or questions?
About the growth of the systems and think I can see like a common like a trend that with the growth of the system grows the power, but at the same time it distributes. And I was wondering if the power is like a necessary element or it can be evaluated somehow and it's like thought of differently.
I mean, yeah, that's of course a key question. Again, I think the main argument is that with increasing connectedness, so with increasing growth of a particular system, any system, you need formal structures to control this system, and that requires narratives, and it requires spaces, and that of course has to do with power, right, and hierarchy, and probably some of it, some power, some hierarchy, and some degree of inequality is probably unavoidable and necessary. On the other hand, what we learn from history is that unequal systems also tend to become fragile and can fail because they on the one hand people revolt against it, and on the other hand they tend to grow beyond what the system in the end can provide. A city becomes too big, or trade routes become too complicated and too vulnerable, etc., etc., etc. And so therefore the questioning of power is, on the one hand, has to do with a sense of fairness and morality, but on the other hand it has, in an almost engineering way of thinking, it has to do with system stability. Right, so you can be a perfect patriot and you can acknowledge the benefits of a particular system, being that a city or being that a political system, and yet still, like a good engineer, you can critique it because you see future instability. And I think that's a capability we should increasingly have.
Thank you.
I have maybe one idea that right now came to my mind when I'm looking on the picture. So it's very interesting because let's say a city has kind of a hard and kind of a soft layer. So hard is physical, and soft is soft are human beings and technologies,
Mm-hmm.
and social and technological, always faster, changing faster
Mm-hmm.
than physical one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of interesting coexistence of these two, because when we are as professionals, right, as urbanists, trying to kind of predict the future and
Mm-hmm.
trying to like rethink the structures, we usually kind of every time we are a step behind. So sometimes we can't catch these changes. So, and sometimes it's really hard to predict it. So could you please comment on maybe your practice and your practical approach, how to work with really unstable systems? Because we usually working with unknown in our practice, so we never know how the system will change. We can think about that, but we are not sure.
I think this is a brilliant question, really a core question. And in the later lectures, I will tell you more in depth how we really work on it and think about it. And we really do not have all the answers, not at all. We're kind of a small office in a global context. make many mistakes, don't have all solutions, etc. Of course not, nobody has that. And at the same time, two things are important. First of all, the key things Katja now said, that cities are always a combination of the hard and the soft, as you said it, right? They are a double complex system, as Portugali would say, only if we take the artifact city and we add the in itself already complex system, humans, and together this forms this double complex system, right? Which then has a dynamic in space and time. So this, I think, is one key issue. And then the other key issue you bring up is the difficulty of synchronizing these two. A difficulty which you specifically painfully experience, of course, as a planning professional. On the other hand, as I said in an earlier lecture, the ability to generate a narrative, with this narrative generate a coalition of people in a project context, and through that implement something new. I think this is, of course, then the benefit of this particular problem, that you can also anticipate change by a shared imagination. And there the term project is extremely important, because a project implies a narrative, so a vision. It implies a group carrying the project, so stakeholders, and it implies a kind of a timeline to implement it, and so on and so on. And it also allows you to think in a semi-autonomous way about the particular narrative in a particular place, right, to effect change. And that is extremely interesting, and maybe one of the potential solutions to it all. But I can talk about that a bit more in depth later, because I think it's the key question, of course. Hey, it has been a pleasure. I need to leave, and I also need to liberate the space here because people are waiting outside. So I propose to end here, and promise that the next lectures will be a little bit more disciplined, and also a bit more applied. And I think a lot of what we have been discussing will come back in spots, but I will talk about things which are closer to your daily life, as well as closer to your practice now or in the future. So thanks for your patience, and enjoy the week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.